Chapter 32 of David Copperfield. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Tig Hines. David Copperfield by Charles Dickens. Chapter 32. The beginning of a long journey. What is natural in me is natural in many other men, I infer, and so I am not afraid to write that I never had loved Steerforth better than when the ties that bound me to him were broken. In the keen distress of the discovery of his unworthiness, I thought more of all that was brilliant in him. I softened more towards all that was good in him. I did more justice to the qualities that might have made him a man of noble nature and a great name, than I ever had done in the height of my devotion to him. Deeply as I felt my own unconscious part in his pollution of an honest home, I believe that if I had been brought face to face with him, I could not have uttered one reproach. I should have loved him so well still, though he fascinated me no longer. I should have held in so much tenderness the memory of my affection for him, that I think I should have been as weak as a spirit-wounded child, in all but the entertainment of a thought that we could ever be reunited. That thought I never had. I felt, as he had felt, that all was at an end between us. What his remembrances of me were, I have never known. They were light enough perhaps, and easily dismissed, but mine of him were as the remembrances of a cherished friend who was dead. Yes, Steerforth, long removed from the scenes of this poor history. My sorrow may bear involuntary witness against you at the judgment throne, but my angry thoughts or my reproaches never will, I know. The news of what had happened soon spread through the town, insomuch that as I passed along the streets next morning, I overheard the people speaking of it at their doors. Many were hard upon her, some few were hard upon him, but towards her second father and her lover there was but one sentiment. Among all kinds of people a respect for them in their distress prevailed, which was full of gentleness and delicacy. The seafaring men kept apart when those two were seen early walking with slow steps on the beach, and stood in knots talking compassionately among themselves. It was on the beach close down by the sea that I found them. It would have been easy to perceive that they had not slept all last night, even if Peggotty had failed to tell me of their still sitting just as I left them, when it was broad day. They looked worn, and I thought Mr. Peggotty's head was bowed in one night more than in all the years I had known him. But they were both as grave and steady as the sea itself, then lying beneath a dark sky, waveless, yet with a heavy roll upon it, as if it breathed in its rest, and touched on the horizon with a strip of silvery light from the unseen sun. "We have had a mort of a talk, sir," said Mr. Peggotty to me, when we had all three walked a little while in silence, "of what we ought and doen't ought to do. But we see our course now." I happened to glance at Ham, then looking out at sea upon the distant light, and a frightful thought came into my mind. Not that his face was angry, for it was not. I recall nothing but an expression of stern determination in it, that if ever he encountered Steerforth, he would kill him. "My duty here, sir," said Mr. Peggotty, "is done, and I'm a-going to seek my—" He stopped, and went on in a firmer voice, "I'm a-going to seek her. That's my duty evermore." He shook his head when I asked him where he would seek her, and inquired if I were going to London tomorrow. I told him I had not gone today, fearing to lose the chance of being of any service to him, but that I was ready to go when he would. "I'll go along with you, sir," he rejoined, "if you're agreeable, tomorrow." We walked on again for a while in silence. "Ham," he presently resumed, "he'll hold on to his present work, and go and live along with my sister. The old boat yonder—" "Will you desert the old boat, Mr. Peggotty?" I gently interposed. "My station, Master Davy," he returned, "ain't there no longer, and if ever a boat foundered, since there was darkness on the face of the deep, that one's gone down. But no, sir, no, I don't mean as it should be deserted, fur from that." We walked on again for a while as before, until he explained. "My wishes is, sir, as it shall look day and night, winter and summer, as it has always looked, since she first knowed it. If ever she should come a-wandering back, I wouldn't have the old place seem to cast her off, you understand, but seem to tempt her to draw nigher to it, and to peep in, maybe, like a ghost, out of the wind and rain, through the old winder at the old seat by the fire. Then maybe, Master Davy, seeing none but Mrs. Gummidge there,
She might take heart to creep in, trembling, and might come to be laid down in her own bed, and rest her weary head where it was once so gay.' I could not speak to him in reply, though I tried. 'Every night,' said Mr. Peggotty, 'as reg'lar as the night comes, the candle must be stood in its old pane of glass, that if ever she should see it, it may seem to say, "Come back, my child, come back." If ever there's a knock, Ham, particular a soft knock, after dark at your aunt's door, don't you go nigh it. Let it be her, not you, that sees my fallen child.' He walked a little in front of us, and kept before us for some minutes. During this interval I glanced at Ham again, and observing the same expression on his face, and his eyes still directed to the distant light, I touched his arm. Twice I called him by his name, in the tone in which I might have tried to rouse a sleeper, before he heeded me. When I at last inquired on what his thoughts were so bent, he replied, 'On what's afore me, Master Davy, and over yon.' 'On the life before you, do you mean?' He had pointed confusedly out to sea. 'Ay, Master Davy, I don't rightly know how 'tis, but from over yon there seemed to me to come the end of it like, looking at me as if he were waking, but with the same determined face.' 'What end?' I asked, possessed by my former fear. 'I don't know,' he said thoughtfully. 'I was calling to mind that the beginning of it all did take place here, and then the end come. But that's gone, Master Davy,' he added, answering, as I think, my look. 'You ha'n't no call to be afeard of me, but I'm kind of muddled. I don't fare to feel no matters.' Which was as much as to say that he was not himself, and quite confounded. Mr. Peggotty stopping for us to join him, we did so, and said no more. The remembrance of this in connection with my former thought, however, haunted me at intervals, even until the inexorable end came at its appointed time. We insensibly approached the old boat and entered. Mrs. Gummidge, no longer moping in her especial corner, was busy preparing breakfast. She took Mr. Peggotty's hat, and placed his seat for him, and spoke so comfortably and softly that I hardly knew her. 'Dan'l, my good man,' she said, 'you must eat and drink, and keep up your strength, for without it you'll do nowt. Try, that's a dear soul, and if I disturb you with my clicketing,' she meant her chattering, 'tell me so, Dan'l, and I won't.' When she had served us all, she withdrew to the window, where she sedulously employed herself in repairing some shirts and other clothes belonging to Mr. Peggotty, and neatly folding and packing them in an old oilskin bag, such as sailors carry. Meanwhile she continued talking in the same quiet manner. 'All times and seasons, you know, Dan'l,' said Mrs. Gummidge, 'I shall allus be here, and everything will look according to your wishes. I'm a poor scholar, but I shall write to you, odd times, when you're away, and send my letters to Master Davy. Perhaps you write to me too, Dan'l, odd times, and tell me how you fare to feel upon your lone, lorn journeys.' 'You'll be a solitary woman here, I'm afeard,' said Mr. Peggotty. 'No, no, Dan'l,' she returned, 'I shan't be that, don't you mind me. I shall have enough to do to keep a being for you,' Mrs. Gummidge meant a home, 'again you come back, to keep a being here for any that may hap to come back, Dan'l. In the fine time I shall set outside the door as I used to do. If any should come nigh, they shall see the old widder woman true to 'em, a long way off.' What a change in Mrs. Gummidge in a little time! She was another woman. She was so devoted, and she had such a quick perception of what it would be well to say, and what it would be well to leave unsaid. She was so forgetful of herself, and so regardful of the sorrow about her, that I held her in a sort of veneration. The work she did that day! There were many things to be brought up from the beach and stored in the outhouse, as oars, nets, sails, cordage, spars, lobster pots, bags of ballast, and the like, and though there was abundance of assistance rendered, there being not a pair of working hands on all that shore but would have laboured hard for Mr. Peggotty, and being well paid in being asked to do it, yet she persisted all day long in toiling under weights that she was quite unequal to, and fagging to and fro on all sorts of unnecessary errands. As to deploring her misfortunes, she appeared to have entirely lost the recollection of ever having had any. She preserved an equable cheerfulness in the midst of her sympathy, which was not the least astonishing part of the change that had come over her. Querulousness was out of the question. I did not even observe her voice to falter, or a tear to escape from her eyes the whole day through, until twilight, when she and I and Mr. Peggotty being alone together, and he having fallen asleep in perfect exhaustion, she broke into a half suppressed fit of sobbing and crying, and taking me to the door, said, 'Ever bless you, Master Davy, be a friend to him, poor dear.' Then she immediately ran out of the house to wash her face, in order that she might sit quietly beside him, and be found at work there when he should awake. In short, I left her, when I went away that night, the prop and staff of Mr. Peggotty's affliction; and I could not meditate enough upon the lesson that I read in Mrs. Gummidge, and the new experience she unfolded to me. It was between 9 and 10 o'clock, when, strolling in a melancholy manner through the town, I stopped at Mr. Omer's door. Mr. Omer had taken it so much to heart, his daughter told me, that he had been very low and poorly all day, and had gone to bed without his pipe. 'A deceitful, bad-hearted girl,' said Mrs. Yoram. 'There was no good in her, ever.' 'Don't say so,' I returned. 'You don't think so.' 'Yes, I do,' cried Mrs. Yoram angrily. 'No, no,' I said. Mrs. Yoram tossed her head, endeavouring to be very stern and cross, but she could not command her softer self, and began to cry. I was young, to be sure, but I thought much the better of her for this sympathy, and fancied it became her, as a virtuous wife and mother, very well indeed. 'Whatever will she do?' sobbed Minnie. 'Where will she go? What will become of her? Oh, how could she be so cruel to herself and him?' I remembered the time when Minnie was a young and pretty girl, and I was glad she remembered it too, so feelingly. 'My little Minnie,' said Mrs. Yoram, 'has only just now got to sleep. Even in her sleep she is sobbing for Emily. All day long little Minnie has cried for her, and asked me over and over again whether Emily was wicked. What can I say to her, when Emily tied a ribbon off her own neck round little Minnie's the last night she was here, and laid her head down on the pillow beside her till she was fast asleep? The ribbon's round my little Minnie's neck now. It ought not to be, perhaps, but what can I do? Emily is very bad, but they were fond of one another, and the child knows nothing.' Mrs. Yoram was so unhappy, that her husband came out to take care of her. Leaving them together, I went home to Peggotty's, more melancholy myself, if possible, than I had been yet. That good creature, I mean Peggotty, all untired by her late anxieties and sleepless nights, was at her brother's, where she meant to stay till morning. An old woman, who had been employed about the house for some weeks past, while Peggotty had been unable to attend to it, was the house's only other occupant besides myself. As I had no occasion for her services, I sent her to bed, by no means against her will, and sat down before the kitchen fire a little while, to think about all this. I was blending it with the deathbed of the late Barkis, and was driving out with the tide toward the distance at which Ham had looked so singularly in the morning, when I was recalled from my wanderings by a knock at the door. There was a knocker upon the door, but it was not that which made the sound. The tap was from a hand, and low down upon the door, as if it were given by a child. It made me start as much as if it had been the knock of a footman to a person of distinction. I opened the door, and at first looked down, to my amazement, on nothing but a great umbrella that appeared to be walking about of itself, but presently I discovered underneath it Miss Moucher. I might not have been prepared to give the little creature a very kind reception, if, on her removing the umbrella, which her utmost efforts were unable to shut up, she had shewn me the volatile expression of face which had made so great an impression on me at our first and last meeting. But her face, as she turned it up to me, was so earnest, and when I relieved her of the umbrella, which would have been an inconvenient one for the Irish giant, she wrung her little hands in such an afflicted manner, that I rather inclined towards her. 'Miss Boucher,' said I, after glancing up and down the empty street, without distinctly knowing what I expected to see besides, 'how do you come here? What is the matter?' She motioned to me with her short right arm to shut the umbrella for her, and, passing me hurriedly, went into the kitchen. When I had closed the door, and followed with the umbrella in my hand, I found her sitting on the corner of the fender. It was a low iron one, with two flat bars at top to stand plates upon, in the shadow of the boiler, swaying herself backwards and forwards, and chafing her hands upon her knees like a person in pain. Quite alarmed at being the only recipient of this untimely visit, and the only spectator of this portentous behaviour, I exclaimed again, 'Pray tell me, Miss Moucher, what is the matter? Are you ill? My dear young soul, returned Miss Moucher, squeezing her hands upon her heart, one over the other, I am ill here. I am very ill. To think that it should come to this, that I might have known it and perhaps prevented it, if I hadn't been a thoughtless fool. Again her large bonnet, very disproportionate to the figure, went backwards and forwards, in her swaying of her little body to and fro, while a most gigantic bonnet rocked in unison with it upon the wall. I am surprised, I began, to see you so distressed and serious, when she interrupted me. Yes, it's always so, she said. They're all surprised, these inconsiderate young people, fairly and full grown, to see any natural feeling in a little thing like me. They make a plaything of me, use me for their amusement, throw me away when they are tired, and wonder that I feel more than a toy horse or a wooden soldier. Yes, that's the way, the old way. It may be with others, I returned, but I do assure you it is not with me. Perhaps I ought not to be at all surprised to see you as you are now. I know so little of you. I said without consideration what I thought. What can I do? Returned the little woman, standing up and holding out her arms to show herself. See, what I am my father was, and my sister is, and my brother is. I have worked for sister and brother these many years, hard, Mr. Copperfield, all day. I must live, I do no harm. If there are people so unreflecting or so cruel as to make a jest of me, what is left for me to do but make a jest of myself, them, and everything? If I do so for the time, whose fault is that? Mine? No, not Miss Moucher's, I perceived. If I had shewn myself a sensitive dwarf to your false friend, pursued the little woman, shaking her head at me with reproachful earnestness, how much of his help or goodwill do you think I should ever had? If little Moucher, who had no hand, young gentleman, in the making of herself, addressed herself to him or the like of him because of her misfortunes, when do you suppose her small voice would have been heard? Little Moucher would have as much need to live, if she was the bitterest and dullest of pygmies, but she couldn't do it. No, she might whistle for her bread and butter till she died of air. Miss Moucher sat down on the fender again, and took out her handkerchief and wiped her eyes. Be thankful for me if you have a kind heart, as I think you have, she said, that while I know well what I am, I can be cheerful and endure it all. I am thankful for myself, at any rate, that I can find my tiny way through the world without being beholden to any one, and that in return for all that is thrown at me, in folly or vanity, as I go along, I can throw bubbles back. If I don't brood over all I want, it is the better for me, and not the worse for any one. If I am a plaything for you giants, be gentle with me. Miss Moucher replaced her handkerchief in her pocket, looking at me with very intent expression all the while, and pursued, I saw you in the street just now. You may suppose that I am not able to walk as fast as you, with my short legs and short breath, and I couldn't overtake you, but I guessed where you came, and came after you. I have been here before, to-day, but the good woman wasn't at home. Do you know her? I demanded. I know of her, and about her, she replied, from Ulmer and Yoram. I was there at 7 o'clock this morning. Do you remember what Steerforth said to me about this unfortunate girl, that time when I saw you both at the inn? The great bonnet on Miss Moucher's head, and the greater bonnet on the wall, began to go backwards and forwards again when she asked this question. I remembered very well what she referred to, having had it in my thoughts many times that day. I told her so. May the father of all evil confound him, said the little woman, holding up her forefinger between me and her sparkling eyes, and 10 times more confound that wicked servant. But I believe it was you who had a boyish passion for her. I repeated. Child, in the name of blind ill fortune, cried Miss Moucher, wringing her hands impatiently, as she went to and fro upon the fender, why did you praise her so, and blush, and look disturbed? I could not conceal from myself that I had done this, though for a reason very different from her supposition. What did I know, said Miss Moucher, taking out her handkerchief again, and giving one little stamp on the ground whenever, at short intervals, she applied it to her eyes with both hands at once. He was crossing you and wheedling you, I saw, and you were soft wax in his hands, I saw. Had I left the room a minute when his man told me that young innocence, so he called you, and you may call him old guilt all the days of your life, had set his heart upon her, and she was giddy and liked him, but his master was resolved that no harm should come of it, more for your sake than hers, and that was their business here.
How could I but believe him? I saw Steerforth soothe and please you by his praise of her. You were the first to mention her name. You owned to an old admiration of her. You were hot and cold, and red and white all at once, when I spoke to you of her. What could I think, what did I think, but that you were a young libertine in everything but experience, and had fallen into hands that had experience enough, and could manage you, having the fancy, for your own good. Oh, they were afraid of my finding out the truth,
exclaimed Miss Moucher, getting off the fender and trotting up and down the kitchen with her two short arms distressfully lifted up.
because I'm a sharp little thing. I need to be, to get through the world it's all. And they deceived me altogether, and I gave the poor unfortunate girl a letter, which I fully believe was the beginning of her ever speaking to Littimer, who was left behind on purpose.
I stood amazed at the revelation of all this perfidy, looking at Miss Moucher as she walked up and down the kitchen until she was out of breath, when she sat upon the fender again, and, drying her face with her handkerchief, shook her head for a long time, without otherwise moving, and without breaking silence.
My country rounds, she added at length, brought me to Norwich, Mr. Copperfield, the night before last. What I happened to find there, about their secret way of coming and going without you, which was strange, led to my suspecting something wrong. I got into the coach from London last night as it came through Norwich, and was here this morning. Oh, too late.
Poor little Moucher turned so chilly after all her crying and fretting, that she turned round on the fender, putting her poor little wet feet in amongst the ashes to warm them, and sat looking at the fire like a large doll. I sat in a chair on the other side of the hearth, lost in unhappy reflections, and looking at the fire too, and sometimes at her.
I must go, she said at last, rising as she spoke. It's late. You don't mistrust me?
Meeting her sharp glance, which was as sharp as ever when she asked me, I could not on that short challenge answer no quite frankly.
Come,
she said, accepting the offer of my hand to help her over the fender, and looking wistfully up into my face.
You know you wouldn't mistrust me if I was a full-sized woman.
I felt that there was much truth in this, and I felt rather ashamed of myself.
You are a young man, she said, nodding. Take a word of advice, even from Freefoot and Nothink. Try not to associate bodily defects with mental, my good friend, except for a solid reason.
She had got over the fender now, and I had got over my suspicion. I told her that I believed she had given me a faithful account of herself, and that we had both been hapless instruments in designing hands. She thanked me, and said I was a good fellow.
Now mind,
she exclaimed, turning back on her way to the door, and looking shrewdly at me with her forefinger up again.
I have some reason to suspect, from what I have heard, my ears are always open, I can't afford to spare what powers I have, that they are gone abroad. But if ever they return, if ever any one of them returns, while I'm alive, I am more likely than another, going about as I do, to find it out soon. Whatever I know, you shall know. If ever I can do anything to serve the poor betrayed girl, I will do it faithfully, please heaven. And Littimer had better have a bloodhound at his back than little Moucher.
I placed implicit faith in this last statement, when I marked the look with which it was accompanied.
Trust me no more, but trust me no less, than you would trust a full-sized woman, said the little creature, touching me appealingly on the wrist. If ever you see me again, unlike what I am now, and like what I was when you first saw me, observe what company I'm in. Call to mind that I am a very helpless and defenceless little thing. Think of me at home with my brother like myself, and my sister like myself, when my day's work is done. Perhaps you won't then be very hard upon me, or surprised if I can be distressed and serious. Good night.
I gave Miss Moucher my hand, with a very different opinion of her from that which I had hitherto entertained, and opened the door to let her out. It was not a trifling business to get the great umbrella up, and properly balanced in her grasp, but at last I successfully accomplished this, and saw it go bobbing down the street through the rain, without the least appearance of having anybody underneath it, except when a heavier fall than usual from some overcharged waterspout sent it toppling over on one side, and discovered Miss Moucher struggling violently to get it right. After making one or two sallies to her relief, which were rendered futile by the umbrella's hopping on again, like an immense bird, before I could reach it, I came in, went to bed, and slept till morning. In the morning I was joined by Mr. Peggotty and my old nurse, and we went at an early hour to the coach office, where Mrs. Gummidge and Ham were waiting to take leave of us. Master Davy, Ham whispered, drawing me aside, while Mr. Peggotty was stowing his bag among the luggage. "His life is quite broken up. He don't know where he's going. He don't know what's afore him. He's bound upon a voyage that'll last on and off all the rest of his days, take my word for it, unless he finds what he's a-seeking of. I'm sure you'll be a friend to him, Master Davy." "Trust me, I will indeed," said I, shaking hands with Ham earnestly. Thank ye very kind, sir. One thing further, I'm in good employ, you know, Master Davy, and I ha'n't no way now of spending what I gets. Money's of no use to me no more, except to live. If you can lay it out for him, I shall do my work with a better heart. Though as to that, sir," and he spoke very steadily and mildly, "you're not to think but I shall work at all times, like a man, and act the best that lays in my power." I told him I was well convinced of it, and I hinted that I hoped the time might even come when he would cease to lead the lonely life he naturally contemplated now. "No, sir," he said, shaking his head, "all that's past and over with me, sir. No one can never fill the place that's empty. But you bear in mind about the money, as there's at all times some laying by for him." Reminding him of the fact that Mr. Peggotty derived a steady, though certainly a very moderate income from the bequest of his late brother-in-law, I promised to do so. We then took leave of each other. I cannot leave him, even now, without remembering with a pang, at once his modest fortitude and his great sorrow. As to Mrs. Gummidge, if I were to endeavour to describe how she ran down the street by the side of the coach, seeing nothing but Mr. Peggotty on the roof, through the tears she tried to repress, and dashing herself against the people who were coming in the opposite direction, I should enter on a task of some difficulty. Therefore I had better leave her sitting on a baker's doorstep, out of breath, with no shape at all remaining in her bonnet, and one of her shoes off, lying on the pavement at a considerable distance. When we got to our journey's end, our first pursuit was to look about for a little lodging for Peggotty, where her brother could have a bed. We were so fortunate as to find one, of a very clean and cheap description, over a chandler's shop, only 2 streets removed from me. When we had engaged this domicile, I bought some cold meat at an eating house, and took my fellow travellers home to tea, a proceeding, I regret to state, which did not meet with Mrs. Crupp's approval, but quite the contrary. I ought to observe, however, in explanation of that lady's state of mind, that she was much offended by Peggotty's tucking up her window's gown before she had been 10 minutes in the place, and setting to work to dust my bedroom. This Mrs. Crupp regarded in the light of a liberty, and a liberty, she said, was a thing she never allowed. Mr. Peggotty had made a communication to me on the way to London, for which I was not unprepared. It was, that he proposed first seeing Mrs. Steerforth. As I felt bound to assist him in this, and also to mediate between them, with a view of sparing the mother's feelings as much as possible, I wrote to her that night. I told her, as mildly as I could, what his wrong was, and what my own share in his injury. I said he was a man in very common life, but of a most gentle and upright character, and that I ventured to express a hope that she would not refuse to see him in his heavy trouble. I mentioned 2 o'clock in the afternoon as the hour of our coming, and I sent the letter myself by the first coach in the morning. At the appointed time we stood at the door of that house where I had been, a few days since, so happy, where my youthful confidence and warmth of heart had been yielded up so freely, which was closed against me henceforth, which was now a waste, a ruin. No Littimer appeared. The pleasanter face which had replaced his on the occasion of my last visit answered to our summons, and went before us to the drawing room. Mrs. Steerforth was sitting there. Rosa Dartle glided, as we went in, from another part of the room, and stood behind her chair. I saw directly, in his mother's face, that she knew from himself what he had done. It was very pale, and bore the traces of deeper emotion than my letter alone, weakened by the doubts her fondness would have raised upon it, would have been likely to create. I thought her more like him than I had ever thought her, and I felt, rather than saw, that the resemblance was not lost on my companion. She sat upright in her arm-chair, with a stately, immovable, passionless air, that it seemed as if nothing could disturb. She looked very steadfastly at Mr. Peggotty when he stood before her, and he looked quite as steadfastly at her. Rosa Dartle's keen glance comprehended all of us. For some moments not a word was spoken. She motioned to Mr. Peggotty to be seated. He said, in a low voice,
I shouldn't feel it natural, ma'am, to sit down in this house. I'd sooner stand.' And this was succeeded by another silence, which she broke thus: 'I know with deep regret what has brought you here. What do you want of me? What do you ask me to do?' He put his hat under his arm, and feeling in his breast for Emily's letter, took it out, unfolded it, and gave it to her. 'Please to read that, ma'am. That's my niece's hand.' She read it in the same stately and impassive way, untouched by its contents as far as I could see, and returned it to him. 'Unless he brings me back a lady,' said Mr. Peggotty, tracing out that part with his finger. 'I come to know, ma'am, whether he will keep his word.' 'No,' she returned. 'Why not?' said Mr. Peggotty. 'It is impossible. He would disgrace himself. You cannot fail to know that she is far below him.' 'Raise her up,' said Mr. Peggotty. 'She is uneducated and ignorant.' 'Maybe she's not, maybe she is,' said Mr. Peggotty. 'I think she's not, ma'am, but I'm no judge of them things. Teach her better.' 'Since you oblige me to speak more plainly, which I am very unwilling to do, her humble connections would render such a thing impossible, if nothing else did.' 'Hark to this, ma'am,' he returned slowly and quietly. 'You know what it is to love your child. So do I. If she was 100 times my child, I couldn't love her more. You do it know what it is to lose your child. I do. All the heaps of riches in the world would be nowt to me, if they was mine, to buy her back. But save her from this disgrace, and she shall never be disgraced by us. Not one of us that she's growed up among, not one of us that's lived along with her and had her for their all in all these many year, will ever look upon her pretty face again. We'll be content to let her be. We'll be content to think of her, far off, as if she were underneath another sun and sky. We'll be content to trust to her husband, to her little children perhaps, and by the time when all of us shall be alike in quality afore our God.' The rugged eloquence with which she spoke was not devoid of all effect. She still preserved her proud manner, but there was a touch of softness in her voice as she answered: 'I justify nothing, I make no counter accusations, but I am sorry to repeat that it is impossible. Such a marriage would irretrievably blight my son's career, and ruin his prospects. Nothing is more certain than that it can never take place, and never will. If there is any other compensation—' 'I am looking at the likeness of the face,' interrupted Mr. Peggotty, with a steady but a kindling eye, 'that has looked at me in my home at my fireside, in my boat, where not, smiling and friendly, when it was so treacherous, that I go half wild when I think of it. If the likeness of that face don't turn to a burning fire at the thought of offering money to me for my child's blight and ruin, it's as bad. I do it know, being a lady's, but what it's worse.' She changed now in a moment. An angry flush overspread her features, and she said, in an intolerant manner, grasping the armchair tightly with her hands: 'What compensation can you make to me for opening such a pit between me and my son? What is your love to mine? What is your separation to ours?' Miss Dartle softly touched her, and bent down her head to whisper, but she would not hear a word. 'No, Rosa, not a word. Let the man listen to what I say. My son, who has been the object of my life, to whom its every thought has been devoted, whom I have gratified from a child in every wish, from whom I have no separate existence since his birth, to take up in a moment with a miserable girl and avoid me, to repay my confidence with systematic deception for her sake, and quit me for her, to set this wretched fancy against his mother's claims upon his love, duty, respect, gratitude, claims that every day and hour of his life should have strengthened into ties that nothing could be proof against. Is this no injury?' Again Rosa Dartle tried to soothe her, again ineffectually. 'I say, Rosa, not a word. If he can stake his all upon the lightest object, I shall stake my all upon a greater purpose. Let him go where he will, with the means that my love has secured to him. Does he think to reduce me by long absence? He knows his mother very little if he does. Let him put away his whim now, and he is welcome back. Let him not put her away, and he shall never come near me, living or dying, while I can raise my hand to make a sign against it, unless, being rid of her for ever, he comes humbly to me, and begs for my forgiveness. This is my right. This is the acknowledgment I will have. This is the separation that there is between us. And is this,' she added, looking at her visitor with the proud intolerant air with which she had begun, 'no injury?' While I heard and saw the mother as she said these words, I seemed to hear and see the son defying them.
All that I had ever seen in him of an unyielding, wilful spirit, I saw in her. All the understanding that I had now of his misdirected energy became an understanding of her character too, and a perception that it was, in its strongest springs, the same. She now observed to me, aloud, resuming her former restraint, that it was useless to hear more, or to say more, and that she begged to put an end to the interview. She rose with an air of dignity to leave the room, when Mr. Peggotty signified that it was needless. "Don't fear me being any hindrance to you. I have no more to say, ma'am," he remarked as he moved towards the door. "I come here with no hope, and I take away no hope. I have done what I thought should be done, but I never looked for any good to come of my standing where I do. This has been too evil a house for me and mine, for me to be put in my right senses and expect it." With this we departed, leaving her standing by her elbow chair, a picture of a noble presence and a handsome face. We had on our way out to cross a paved hall, with glass sides and roof, over which a vine was trained. Its leaves and shoots were green then, and the day being sunny, a pair of glass doors leading to the garden were thrown open. Rosa Dartle, entering this way with a noiseless step, when we were close to them, addressed herself to me. "You do well," she said, "indeed to bring this fellow here." Such a concentration of rage and scorn as darkened her face and flashed in her jet black eyes, I could not have thought compressible even into that face. The scar made by the hammer was, as usual in this excited state of her features, strongly marked. When the throbbing I had seen before came into it as I looked at her, she absolutely lifted up her hand and struck it. "This is a fellow," she said, "to champion and bring here, is he not? You are a true man." "Miss Dartle," I returned, "you are surely not so unjust as to condemn me." "Why do you bring division between these two mad creatures?" she returned. "Don't you know that they are both mad with their own self-will and pride?" "Is it my doing?" I returned. "Is it your doing?" she retorted. "Why do you bring this man here?" "He's a deeply injured man, Miss Dartle," I replied. "You may not know it." "I know that James Steerforth," she said with her hand upon her bosom, as if to prevent the storm that was raging there from being loud, "has a false corrupt heart, and is a traitor. But what need I know or care about this fellow, and his common niece?" "Miss Dartle," I ventured, "you deepen the injury, it is sufficient already. I will only say at parting, that you do him a great wrong." "I do him no wrong," she returned. "They are a depraved worthless set. I should have her whipped." Mr. Peggotty passed on without a word, and went out at the door. "Oh, shame, Miss Dartle, shame," I said indignantly. "How can you bear to trample on his undeserved affliction?" "I would trample on them all," she answered. "I would have his house pulled down. I would have her branded on the face, dressed in rags, and cast out in the streets to starve. If I had the power to sit in judgment on her, I would see it done. See it done! I would do it. I detest her. If I ever could reproach her with her infamous condition, I would go anywhere to do it. If I could hunt her to the grave, I would. If there was any word of comfort that would be a solace to her in her dying hour, and only I possessed it, I wouldn't part with it for life itself." The mere vehemence of her words can convey, I am sensible, but a weak impression of the passion by which she was possessed, and which made itself articulate in her whole figure. Though her voice, instead of being raised, was lower than usual, no description I could give of her would do justice to my recollection of her, or to her entire deliverance of herself to anger. I have seen passion in many forms, but I have never seen it in such a form as that. When I joined Mr. Peggotty, he was walking slowly and thoughtfully down the hill. He told me, as soon as I came up with him, that having now discharged his mind of what he had proposed doing in London, he meant to set out on his travels that night. I asked him where he meant to go. He only answered, "I'm a going, sir, to seek my niece." We went back to the little lodging over the chandler's shop, and there I found an opportunity of repeating to Peggotty what he had said to me. She informed me in return that he had said the same thing to her that morning. She knew no more than I did where he was going, but she thought he had some project shaped in his mind. I did not like to leave him under such circumstances, and we all three dined together off a beefsteak pie, which was one of the many good things for which Peggotty was famous, and which was curiously flavoured on this occasion, I recollect well, by a miscellaneous taste of tea, coffee, butter,
bacon, cheese, new loaves, firewood, candles, and walnut ketchup continually ascending from the shop. After dinner we sat for an hour or so near the window without talking much, and then Mr. Peggotty got up and brought his oilskin bag and his stout stick and laid them on the table. He accepted from his sister's stock of ready money a small sum on account of his legacy, barely enough I should have thought to keep him for a month. He promised to communicate with me when anything befell him, and he slung his bag about him, took his hat and stick, and bade us both good-bye. "All good attend you, dear old woman," he said, embracing Peggotty, "and you too, Master Davy," shaking hands with me. "I'm a-going to seek her fur and wide, if she should come home while I'm away, but that ain't like to be. Or if I should bring her back, my meaning is that she and me shall live and die where no one can reproach her. If any hurt should come to me, remember that the last words I left for her was, 'My unchanged love is with my darling child, and I forgive her.'" He said this solemnly, bareheaded, then putting on his hat he went down the stairs and away. We followed to the door. It was a warm, dusty evening, just the time when, in the great main thoroughfare out of which that byway turned, there was a temporary lull in the eternal tread of feet upon the pavement, and a strong red sunshine. He turned alone at the corner of our shady street into a glow of light in which we lost him. Rarely did that hour of evening come. Rarely did I wake up at night. Rarely did I look up at the moon or stars, or watch the falling rain, or hear the wind, but I thought of his solitary figure toiling along, poor pilgrim, and recalled the words, "I'm a-going to seek her fur and wide. If any hurt should come to me, remember that the last words I left for her was, 'My unchanged love is with my darling child, and I forgive her.'" End of chapter 32.
Of David Copperfield. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Tig Hines. David Copperfield by Charles Dickens. Chapter 33. Blissful. All this time I had gone on loving Dora harder than ever. Her idea was my refuge in disappointment and distress, and made some amends to me even for the loss of my friend. The more I pitied myself or pitied others, the more I sought for consolation in the image of Dora. The greater the accumulation of deceit and trouble in the world, the brighter and the purer shone the star of Dora high above the world. I don't think I had any definite idea where Dora came from, or in what degree she was related to a higher order of beings, but I am quite sure I should have scouted the notion of her being simply human, like any other young lady, with indignation and contempt. If I may so express it, I was steeped in Dora. I was not merely over head and ears in love with Dora, but I was saturated through and through. Enough love might have been wrung out of me, metaphorically speaking, to drown anybody in, and yet there would have remained enough within me, and all over me, to pervade my entire existence. The first thing I did on my own account when I came back was to take a night walk to Norwood, and, like the subject of a venerable riddle of my childhood, to go round and round the house, without ever touching the house, thinking about Dora. I believe the theme of this incomprehensible conundrum was the moon. No matter what it was, I, the moon-struck slave of Dora, perambulated round and round the house and garden for 2 hours, looking through crevices in the palings, getting my chin by dint of violent exertion above the rusty nails on the top, blowing kisses at the lights in the windows, and romantically calling on the night at intervals to shield my Dora, I don't know exactly what from. I suppose from fire, perhaps from mice, to which she had a great objection. My love was so much in my mind, and it was so natural to me to confide in Peggotty, when I found her again by my side of an evening with the old set of industrial implements, busily making the tour of my wardrobe, that I imparted to her, in a sufficiently roundabout way, my great secret. Peggotty was strongly interested, but I could not get her into my view of the case at all. She was audaciously prejudiced in my favour, and quite unable to understand why I should have any misgivings, or be low-spirited about it. "The young lady might think herself well off," she observed, "to have such a beau. And as to her pa," she said, "what did the gentleman expect, for gracious sake?"
I observed, however, that Mr. Spenlow's proctorial gown and stiff cravat took Peggotty down a little, and inspired her with a greater reverence for the man who was gradually becoming more and more etherealized in my eyes every day, and about whom a reflected radiance seemed to me to beam when he sat erect in court among his papers, like a little lighthouse in a sea of stationery. And by the by, it used to be uncommonly strange to me to consider, I remember, as I sat in court too, how those dim old judges and doctors wouldn't have cared for Dora if they had known her, how they wouldn't have gone out of their senses with rapture if marriage with Dora had been proposed to them, how Dora might have sung and played upon that glorified guitar until she led me to the verge of madness, yet not have tempted one of those slow goers an inch out of his road. I despise them to a man. Frozen out old gardeners in the flower beds of the heart, I took a personal offence against them all. The bench was nothing to me but an insensible blunderer. The bar had no more tenderness or poetry in it than the bar of a public house. Taking the management of Peggotty's affairs into my own hands with no little pride, I proved the will, and came to a settlement with the Legacy Duty Office, and took her to the bank, and soon got everything into an orderly train. We varied the legal character of these proceedings by going to see some perspiring waxwork in Fleet Street, melted, I should hope, these 20 years, and by visiting Miss Linwood's exhibition, which I remember as a mausoleum of needlework, favourable to self-examination and repentance, and by inspecting the Tower of London, and going to the top of St. Paul's. All these wonders afforded Peggotty as much pleasure as she was able to enjoy, under existing circumstances, except, I think, St. Paul's, which, from her long attachment to her work-box, became a rival of the picture on the lid, and was, in some particulars, vanquished, she considered, by that work of art. Peggotty's business, which was what we used to call common form business in the Commons, and very light and lucrative the common form business was, being settled, I took her down to the office one morning to pay her bill. Mr. Spenlow had stepped out, old Tiffey said, to get a gentleman sworn for a marriage licence, but as I knew he would be back directly, our place lying close to the surrogates and to the Vicar General's office too, I told Peggotty to wait. We were a little like undertakers in the Commons, as regarded probate transactions, generally making it a rule to look more or less cut up when we had to deal with clients in mourning. In a similar feeling of delicacy we were always blithe and light-hearted with the licensed clients. Therefore I hinted to Peggotty that she would find Mr. Spenlow much recovered from the shock of Mr. Barkis's decease, and indeed he came in like a bridegroom. But neither Peggotty nor I had eyes for him when we saw, in company with him, Mr. Murdstone. He was very little changed. His hair looked as thick, and was certainly as black, as ever, and his glance was as little to be trusted as of old. "Ah, Copperfield," said Mr. Spenlow, "you know this gentleman, I believe?" I made my gentleman a distant bow, and Peggotty barely recognized him. He was at first somewhat disconcerted to meet us two together, but quickly decided what to do, and came up to me. "I hope," he said, "that you are doing well." "It can hardly be interesting to you," said I. "Yes, if you wish to know." We looked at each other, and he addressed himself to Peggotty. "And you," he said, "I am sorry to observe that you have lost your husband." "It's not the first loss I have had in my life, Mr. Murdstone," replied Peggotty, trembling from head to foot. "I am glad to hope that there is nobody to blame for this one, nobody to answer for it." "Ah," said he, "that's a comfortable reflection. You have done your duty." "I have not worn anybody's life away," said Peggotty, "I am thankful to think. No, Mr. Murdstone, I have not worrited and frightened any sweet creature to an early grave." He eyed her gloomily, remorsefully I thought, for an instant, and said, turning his head towards me, but looking at my feet instead of my face, "We are not likely to encounter soon again. A source of satisfaction to us both, no doubt, for such meetings as this can never be agreeable. I do not expect that you, who always rebelled against my just authority, exerted for your benefit and reformation, should owe me any good will now. There is an antipathy between us." "An old one, I believe," said I, interrupting him. He smiled, and shot as evil a glance at me as could come from his dark eyes. "It rankled in your baby breast," he said. "It embittered the life of your poor mother. You are right. I hope you may do better yet. I hope you may correct yourself." Here he ended the dialogue, which had been carried on in a low voice in a corner of the outer office, by passing into Mr. Spenlow's room, and saying aloud, in his smoothest manner, Gentlemen of Mr. Spenlow's profession are accustomed to family differences, and know how complicated and difficult they always are. With that he paid the money for his licence, and receiving it neatly folded from Mr. Spenlow, together with a shake of his hand, and a polite wish for his happiness and the lady's, went out of the office. I might have had more difficulty in constraining myself to be silent under his words, if I had had less difficulty in impressing upon Peggotty, who was only angry on my account, good creature, that we were not in a place for recrimination, and that I besought her to hold her peace. She was so unusually roused, that I was glad to compound for an affectionate hug, elicited by this revival in her mind of her old injuries, and to make the best I could of it before Mr. Spenlow and the clerks. Mr. Spenlow did not appear to know what the connection between Mr. Murdstone and myself was, which I was glad of, for I could not bear to acknowledge him, even in my own breast, remembering what I did of the history of my poor mother. Mr. Spenlow seemed to think, if he thought anything about the matter, that my aunt was the leader of the state party in our family, and that there was a rebel party commanded by someone else. So I gathered at last from what he said, while we were waiting for Mr. Tiffey to make out Peggotty's bill of costs. "Miss Trotwood," he remarked, "is very firm, no doubt, and not likely to give way to opposition. I have an admiration for her character, and I may congratulate you, Copperfield, on being on the right side. Differences between relations are much to be deplored, but they are extremely general, and the great thing is to be on the right side, meaning, I take it, on the side of the moneyed interest." "Rather a good marriage this, I believe," said Mr. Spenlow. I explained that I knew nothing about it. "Indeed," he said, speaking from the few words Mr. Murdstone dropped, as a man frequently does on these occasions, and from what Miss Murdstone let fall, "I should say it was rather a good marriage." "Do you mean that there is money, sir?" I asked. "Yes," said Mr. Spenlow, "I understand there's money. Beauty too, I am told." "Indeed. Is his new wife young?" "Just of age," said Mr. Spenlow, "so lately that I should think they have been waiting for that." "Lord deliver her," said Peggotty, so very emphatically and unexpectedly that we were all three discomposed, until Tiffey came in with the bill. Old Tiffey soon appeared, however, and handed it to Mr. Spenlow to look over. Mr. Spenlow, settling his chin in his cravat and rubbing it softly, went over the items with a deprecatory air, as if it were all Jorkins's doing, and handed it back to Tiffey with a bland sigh. "Yes," he said, "that's right, quite right. I should have been extremely happy, Copperfield, to have limited these charges to the actual expenditure out of pocket, but it is an irksome incident in my professional life that I am not at liberty to consult my own wishes. I have a partner, Mr. Jorkins." As he said this with a gentle melancholy, which was the next thing to making no charge at all, I expressed my acknowledgments on Peggotty's behalf, and paid Tiffey in bank notes. Peggotty then retired to her lodgings, and Mr. Spenlow and I went into court, where we had a divorce suit coming on, under an ingenious little statute, repealed now I believe, but in virtue of which I have seen several marriages annulled, of which the merits were these. The husband, whose name was Thomas Benjamin, had taken out his marriage licence as Thomas only, suppressing the Benjamin in case he should not find himself as comfortable as he expected. Not finding himself as comfortable as he expected, or being a little fatigued with his wife, poor fellow, he now came forward, by a friend, after being married a year or two, and declared that his name was Thomas Benjamin, and therefore he was not married at all, which the court confirmed to his great satisfaction. I must say that I had my doubts about the strict justice of this, and was not even frightened out of them by the bushel of wheat which reconciles all anomalies. But Mr. Spenlow argued the matter with me. He said, "Look at the world, there was good and evil in that. Look at the ecclesiastical law, there was good and evil in that. It was all part of a system. Very good. There you were." I had not the hardihood to suggest to Dora's father that possibly we might even improve the world a little, if we got up early in the morning, and took off our coats to the work, but I confessed that I thought we might improve the commons. Mr. Spenlow replied that he would particularly advise me to dismiss that idea from my mind, as not being worthy of my gentlemanly character, but that he would be glad to hear from me of what improvement I thought the commons susceptible. Taking that part of the commons which happened to be nearest to us, for our man was unmarried by this time, and we were out of court, and strolling past the Prerogative Office, I submitted that I thought the Prerogative Office rather a queerly managed institution. Mr. Spenlow inquired in what respect. I replied, with all due deference to his experience, but with more deference I am afraid to his being Dora's father, that perhaps it was a little nonsensical that the registry of that court, containing the original wills of all persons leaving effects within the immense province of Canterbury, for 3 whole centuries, should be an accidental building, never designed for the purpose, leased by the registrars for their own private emolument, unsafe, not even ascertained to be fireproof, choked with the important documents it held, and positively, from the roof to the basement, a mercenary speculation of the registrars, who took great fees from the public, and crammed the public's wills away anyhow and anywhere, having no other object than to get rid of them cheaply. That perhaps it was a little unreasonable that these registrars, in the receipt of profits amounting to 8 or 9,000 pounds a year, to say nothing of the profits of the deputy registrars and clerks of seats, should not be obliged to spend a little of that money in finding a reasonably safe place for the important documents which all classes of people were compelled to hand over to them, whether they would or no. That perhaps it was a little unjust that all the great offices in this great office should be magnificent sinecures, while the unfortunate working clerks in the old dark room upstairs were the worst rewarded, and the least considered men, doing important services in London. That perhaps it was a little indecent that the principal registrar of all, whose duty it was to find the public, constantly resorting to this place, all needful accommodation, should be an enormous sinecurist in virtue of that post, and might be, besides, a clergyman, a pluralist, a holder of a staff in a cathedral, and what not, while the public was put to the inconvenience of which we have a specimen every afternoon when the office was busy, and which we knew to be quite monstrous. That perhaps, in short, this prerogative office of the diocese of Canterbury was altogether such a pestilent job, and such a pernicious absurdity, that but for its being squeezed away in a corner of St. Paul's churchyard, which few people knew, it must have been turned completely inside out and upside down long ago. Mr. Spenlow smiled as I became modestly warm on the subject, and then argued this question with me as he had argued the other. He said, what was it after all? It was a question of feeling. If the public felt that their wills were in safe keeping, and took it for granted that the office was not to be made better, who was the worse for it? Nobody. Who was the better for it? All the sinecurists. Very well. Then the good predominated. It might not be a perfect system, nothing was perfect, but what he objected to was the insertion of the wedge. Under the prerogative office the country had been glorious. Insert the wedge into the prerogative office and the country would cease to be glorious. He considered it the principle of a gentleman to take things as he found them, and he had no doubt the prerogative office would last our time. I defer to his opinion, though I had great doubts of it myself. I find he was right, however, for it has not only lasted to the present moment, but has done so in the teeth of a great parliamentary report made, not too willingly, 18 years ago, when all these objections of mine were set forth in detail, and when the existing stowage for wills was described as equal to the accumulation of only 2½ years more. What they have done with them since, whether they have lost many, or whether they sell any, now and then, to the butter shops, I don't know. I am glad mine is not there, and I hope it may not go there yet a while. I have set all this down in my present blissful chapter, because here it comes into its natural place. Mr. Spenlow and I falling into this conversation, prolonged it and our saunter to and fro, until we diverged into general topics. And so it came about in the end that Mr. Spenlow told me that this day week was Dora's birthday, and he would be glad if I would come down and join a little picnic on the occasion. I went out of my senses immediately, became a mere driveller next day, on receipt of a little lace-edged sheet of note-paper, favoured by papa to remind, and passed the intervening period in a state of dotage. I think I committed every possible absurdity in the way of preparation for this blessed event. I turn hot when I remember the cravat I bought. My boots might be placed in any collection of instruments of torture. I provided, and sent down by the Norwood coach the night before, a delicate little hamper, amounting in itself, I thought, almost to a declaration. There were crackers in it with the tenderest mottos that could be got for money. At 6 in the morning I was in Covent Garden Market, buying a bouquet for Dora. At 10 I was on horseback. I hired a gallant grey for the occasion, with a bouquet in my hat to keep it fresh, trotting down to Norwood. I suppose that when I saw Dora in the garden and pretended not to see her, and rode past the house pretending to be anxiously looking for it, I committed 2 small fooleries which other young gentlemen in my circumstances might have committed, because they came so very natural to me. But oh, when I did find the house, and did dismount at the garden gate, and drag those stony hearted boots across the lawn to Dora, sitting on a garden seat under a lilac tree, what a spectacle she was, upon that beautiful morning, among the butterflies, with a white chip bonnet, and a dress of celestial blue. There was a young lady with her, comparatively stricken in years, almost 20, I should say. Her name was Miss Mills, and Dora called her Julia. She was the bosom friend of Dora, the happy Miss Mills. Jip was there, and Jip would bark at me again. When I presented my bouquet, he gnashed his teeth with jealousy. Well he might, if he had the least idea how I adored his mistress. Well he might. "Oh, thank you, Mr. Copperfield. What dear flowers," said Dora. I had an intention of saying, and had been studying the best form of words for 3 miles, that I thought them beautiful before I saw them so near her, but I couldn't manage it. She was too bewildering. To see her lay the flowers against her little dimpled chin was to lose all presence of mind and power of language in a feeble ecstasy. "I wonder I didn't say, 'Kill me, if you have a heart, Miss Mills. Let me die here.'" Then Dora held my flowers to Jip to smell. Then Jip growled and wouldn't smell them. Then Dora laughed and held them a little closer to Jip to make him. Then Jip laid hold of a bit of geranium with his teeth and worried imaginary cats in it. Then Dora beat him and pouted and said, "My poor beautiful flowers," as compassionately I thought as if Jip had laid hold of me. I wished he had. "You'll be glad to hear, Mr. Copperfield," said Dora, that cross Miss Murdstone is not here. She has gone to her brother's marriage, and will be away at least 3 weeks. Isn't that delightful?" I said I was sure it must be delightful to her, and all that was delightful to her was delightful to me. Miss Mills, with an air of superior wisdom and benevolence, smiled upon us. "She's the most disagreeable thing I ever saw," said Dora. "You can't believe how ill-tempered and shocking she is, Julia." "Yes, I can, my dear," said Julia. "You can, perhaps, love," returned Dora, with her hand on Julia's. "Forgive my not accepting you, my dear, at first." I learned from this that Miss Mills had had her trials in the course of a chequered existence, and that to these, perhaps, I might refer that wise benignity of manner which I had already noticed. I found in the course of the day that this was the case, Miss Mills having been unhappy in a misplaced affection, and being understood to have retired from the world on her awful stock of experience, but still to take a calm interest in the unblighted hopes and loves of youth. But now Mr. Spenlow came out of the house, and Dora went to him, saying, "Look, papa, what beautiful flowers!" And Miss Mills smiled thoughtfully, as who should say, "Ye Mayflies, enjoy your brief existence in the bright morning of life." And we all walked from the lawn towards the carriage, which was getting ready. I shall never have such a ride again. I have never had such another. There were only those 3, their hamper, my hamper, and the guitar case in the phaeton, and, of course, the phaeton was open, and I rode behind it, and Dora sat with her back to the horses, looking towards me. She kept the bouquet close to her on the cushion, and wouldn't allow Jip to sit on that side of her at all, for fear he should crush it. She often carried it in her hand, often refreshed herself with its fragrance. Our eyes at those times often met, and my great astonishment is that I didn't go over the head of my gallant grey into the carriage. There was dust, I believe. There was a good deal of dust, I believe. I have a faint impression that Mr. Spenlow remonstrated with me for riding in it, but I knew none. I was sensible of a mist of love and beauty about Dora, but of nothing else. He stood up sometimes and asked me what I thought of the prospect. I said it was delightful, and I dare say it was, but it was all Dora to me. The sun shone Dora, and the birds sang Dora. The south wind blew Dora, and the wild flowers in the hedges were all Dora's to a bud. My comfort is, Miss Mills understood me. Miss Mills alone could enter into my feelings thoroughly. I don't know how long we were going, and to this hour I know as little where we went. Perhaps it was near Guildford. Perhaps some Arabian Night magician opened up the whole place for a day, and shut it up for ever when we came away. It was a green spot on a hill carpeted with soft turf. There were shady trees and heather, and as far as the eye could see a rich landscape. It was a trying thing to find people there waiting for us, and my jealousy, even of the ladies, knew no bounds. But all of my own sex, especially one impostor, 3 or 4 years my elder, with a red whisker, on which he established an amount of presumption not to be endured, were my mortal foes. We all unpacked our baskets and employed ourselves in getting dinner ready. Red Whisker pretended he could make a salad, which I don't believe, and abjured himself on public notice. Some of the young ladies washed the lettuce for him, and sliced them under his directions. Dora was among these, and I felt that fate had pitted me against this man, and one of us must fall. Red Whisker made his salad. I wonder how they could eat it. Nothing could have induced me to touch it. And voted himself into the charge of the wine cellar, which he constructed, being an ingenious beast, in the hollow of a tree trunk. By and by I saw him, with the majority of a lobster on his plate, eating his dinner at the feet of Dora. I have but an indistinct idea of what happened for some time after this baleful object presented itself to my view. I was very merry, I know, but it was hollow merriment. I attached myself to a young creature in pink with little eyes, and flirted with her desperately. She received my attentions with favour, but whether on my account solely, or because she had any designs on Red Whisker, I can't say. Dora's health was drunk. When I drank it, I affected to interrupt my conversation for that purpose, and to resume it immediately afterwards. I caught Dora's eye as I bowed to her, and I thought it looked appealing, but it looked at me over the head of Red Whisker, and I was adamant. The young creature in pink had a mother in green, and I rather think the latter separated us from motives of policy. Howbeit, there was a general breaking up of the party, while the remnants of the dinner were being put away, and I strolled off by myself among the trees in a raging and remorseful state. I was debating whether I should pretend that I was not well, and fly, I don't know where, upon my gallant grey, when Dora and Miss Mills met me. "Mr. Copperfield," said Miss Mills, "you are dull." I begged her pardon, not at all. "And Dora," said Miss Mills, "you are dull." "Oh dear no, not in the least." "Mr. Copperfield and Dora," said Miss Mills, with an almost venerable air, "enough of this. Do not allow a trivial misunderstanding to wither the blossoms of spring, which once put forth and blighted cannot be renewed. I speak," said Miss Mills, "from experience of the past, the remote irrevocable past. The gushing fountains which sparkle in the sun must not be stopped in mere caprice. The oasis in the desert of Sahara must not be plucked up idly." I hardly knew what I did. I was burning all over to that extraordinary extent, but I took Dora's little hand and kissed it, and she let me. I kissed Miss Mills's hand, and we all seemed, to my thinking, to go straight up to the seventh heaven. We did not come down again. We stayed up there all evening. At first we strayed to and fro among the trees, I with Dora's shy arm drawn through mine, and heaven knows, folly as it all was, it would have been a happy fate to have been struck immortal with those foolish feelings, and have stayed among the trees for ever. But much too soon we heard the others laughing and talking, and calling, "Where's Dora?" So we went back, and they wanted Dora to sing. Red Whisker would have got the guitar case out of the carriage, but Dora told him nobody knew where it was but I, so Red Whisker was done for in a moment, and I got it, and I unlocked it, and I took the guitar out, and I sat by her, and I held her handkerchief and gloves, and I drank in every note of her dear voice, and she sang to me who loved her, and all the others might applaud as much as they liked, but they had nothing to do with it. I was intoxicated with joy. I was afraid it was too happy to be real, and that I should wake in Buckingham Street presently, and hear Mrs. Crupp clinking the teacups in getting breakfast ready. But Dora sang, and the others sang, and Miss Mills sang, about the slumbering echoes in the caverns of memory, as if she were 100 years old, and the evening came on, and we had tea with the little kettle boiling gipsy fashion, and I was still as happy as ever. I was happier than ever when the party broke up, and the other people, defeated Red Whisker and all, went their several ways, and we went ours through the still evening and the dying light, with sweet scents rising up around us. Mr. Spenlow, being a little drowsy after the champagne, honour to the soil that grew the grape, to the grape that made the wine, to the sun that ripened it, and to the merchant who adulterated it, and being fast asleep in a corner of the carriage, I rode up by the side and talked to Dora. She admired my horse and patted him. Oh, what a dear little hand it looked upon a horse! And her shawl would not keep right, and now and then I drew it round her with my arm, and I even fancied that Jip began to see how it was, and to understand that he must make up his mind to be friends with me. That sagacious Miss Mills too, that amiable though quite used up recluse, that little patriarch of something less than 20, who had done with the world, and mustn't on any account have the slumbering echoes in the caverns of memory awakened, what a kind thing she did. 'Mr. Copperfield,' said Miss Mills, 'come to this side of the carriage a moment, if you can spare a moment. I want to speak to you.' Behold me, on my gallant grey, bending at the side of Miss Mills, with my hand on the carriage door. 'Dora is coming to stay with me. She's coming home with me the day after tomorrow. If you would like to call, I am sure papa would be happy to see you.' What could I do but invoke a silent blessing on Miss Mills's head, and store Miss Mills's address in the securest corner of my memory? What could I do but tell Miss Mills, with grateful looks and fervent words, how much I appreciated her good offices, and what an inestimable value I set upon her friendship? Then Miss Mills benignantly dismissed me, saying, 'Go back to Dora.' And I went, and Dora leaned out of the carriage to talk to me, and we talked all the rest of the way, and I rode my gallant grey so close to the wheel that I grazed his near fore leg against it, and 'took the bark off,' as his owner told me, to the tune of 3 pund 7, which I paid, and thought extremely cheap for so much joy. What time Miss Mills sat looking at the moon, murmuring verses, and recalling, I suppose, the ancient days when she and earth had anything in common. Norwood was many miles too near, and we reached it many hours too soon, but Mr. Spenlow came to himself a little short of it, and said, 'You must come in, Copperfield, and rest.' And I consenting, we had sandwiches, and wine and water. In the light room, Dora, blushing, looked so lovely that I could not tear myself away, but sat there staring in a dream, until the snoring of Mr. Spenlow inspired me with sufficient consciousness to take my leave. So we parted, I riding all the way to London with the farewell touches of Dora's hand still light on mine, recalling every incident and word 10,000 times, lying down on my own bed at last, as enraptured a young noodle as ever was carried out of his 5 wits by love. When I awoke next morning, I was resolute to declare my passion to Dora, and know my fate. Happiness or misery was now the question. There was no other question that I knew of in the world, and only Dora could give the answer to it. I passed 3 days in a luxury of wretchedness, torturing myself by putting every conceivable variety of discouraging construction on all that ever had taken place between Dora and me. At last, arrayed for the purpose at a vast expense, I went to Miss Mills's, fraught with a declaration. How many times I went up and down the street, and round the square, painfully aware of being a much better answer to the old riddle than the original one, before I could persuade myself to go up the steps and knock, is no matter now. Even when at last I had knocked, and was waiting at the door, I had some flurried thought of asking if that were Mr. Blackboy's, in imitation of poor Barkis, begging pardon and retreating, but I kept my ground. Mr. Mills was not at home. I did not expect he would be. Nobody wanted him. Miss Mills was at home. Miss Mills would do. I was shown into a room upstairs where Miss Mills and Dora were. Jip was there. Miss Mills was copying music. I recollect it was a new song called Affection's Dirge, and Dora was painting flowers. What were my feelings when I recognized my own flowers, the identical Covent Garden Market purchase? I cannot say that they were very like, or that they particularly resembled any flowers that ever came under my observation, but I knew from the paper around them, which was accurately copied, what the composition was. Miss Mills was very glad to see me, and very sorry her papa was not at home, though I thought we all bore that with fortitude. Miss Mills was conversational for a few minutes, and then, laying down her pen upon Affection's Dirge, got up and left the room. I began to think I would put it off till tomorrow. 'I hope your poor horse was not tired when he got home that night,' said Dora, lifting up her beautiful eyes. 'It was a long way for him.' I began to think I would do it to-day. 'It was a long way for him,' I said, 'for he had nothing to uphold him on the journey.' 'Wasn't he fed, poor thing?' asked Dora. I began to think I would put it off till tomorrow. 'Yes,' I said, 'he was well taken care of. I mean, he had not the unutterable happiness that I had in being so near you.' Dora bent her head over her drawing, and said, after a little while, I sat in the interval in a burning fever, and with my legs in a very rigid state, 'You didn't seem to be sensible of that happiness yourself, at one time of the day?' I saw now that I was in for it, and that it must be done on the spot.
You didn't care for that happiness in the least,' said Dora, slightly raising her eyebrow and shaking her head, 'when you were sitting by Miss Kit.' Kit, I should observe, was the name of the creature in pink with the little eyes. 'Though certainly I don't know why you should,' said Dora, 'or why you should call it a happiness at all. But of course you don't mean what you say, and I am sure no one doubts your being at liberty to do whatever you like. Jip, you naughty boy, come here.' I don't know how I did it. I did it in a moment. I intercepted Jip. I had Dora in my arms. I was full of eloquence. I never stopped for a word. I told her how I loved her. I told her I should die without her. I told her that I idolized and worshipped her. Jip barked madly all the time. When Dora hung her head and cried and trembled, my eloquence increased so much the more. If she would like me to die for her, she had but to say the word, and I was ready. Life without Dora's love was not a thing to have on any terms. I couldn't bear it, and I wouldn't. I had loved her every minute, day and night, since I first saw her. I loved her at that minute to distraction. I would always love her every minute to distraction. Lovers had loved before, and lovers would love again, but no lover had ever loved, might, could, would, or should ever love as I loved Dora. The more I raved, the more Jip barked. Each of us in his own way got more mad every moment. Well, Dora and I were sitting on the sofa by and by, quiet enough, and Jip was lying in her lap, winking peacefully at me. It was off my mind. I was in a state of perfect rapture. Dora and I were engaged. I suppose we had some notion that this was to end in marriage. We must have had some, because Dora stipulated that we were never to be married without her papa's consent. But in our youthful ecstasy, I don't think that we really looked before us or behind us, or had any aspiration beyond the ignorant present. We were to keep our secret from Mr. Spenlow, but I am sure the idea never entered my head then that there was anything dishonourable in that. Miss Mills was more than usually pensive when Dora, going to find her, brought her back. I apprehend because there was a tendency in what had passed to awaken the slumbering echoes in the caverns of memory. But she gave us her blessing, and the assurance of her lasting friendship, and spoke to us generally, as became a voice from the cloister. What an idle time it was! What an insubstantial, happy, foolish time it was! When I measured Dora's finger for a ring that was to be made of forget-me-nots, and when the jeweller, to whom I took the measure, found me out, and laughed over his order book, and charged me anything he liked for the pretty little toy, with its blue stones, so associated in my remembrance with Dora's hand, that yesterday, when I saw such another by chance on the finger of my own daughter, there was a momentary stirring in my heart like pain. When I walked about, exalted with my secret, and full of my own interest, and felt the dignity of loving Dora, and of being beloved, so much, that if I had walked on air I could not have been more above the people not so situated, who are creeping on the earth. When we had those meetings in the garden of the square, and sat within the dingy summer house, so happy that I love the London sparrows to this hour for nothing else, and see the plumage of the tropics in their smoky feathers. When we had our first great quarrel within a week of our betrothal, and when Dora sent me back the ring enclosed in a despairing cocked hat note, wherein she used the terrible expression that our love had begun in folly and ended in madness, which dreadful words occasioned me to tear my hair and cry that all was over. When, under cover of the night, I flew to Miss Mills, whom I saw by stealth in the back kitchen where there was a mangle, and implored Miss Mills to interpose between us and avert insanity, when Miss Mills undertook the office and returned with Dora, exhorting us, from the pulpit of her own bitter youth, to mutual concession and the avoidance of the desert of Sahara. When we cried and made it up, and were so blessed again, that the back kitchen, mangle and all, changed to love's own temple, where we arranged a plan of correspondence through Miss Mills, always to comprehend at least one letter on each side every day. What an idle time! What an insubstantial, happy, foolish time! Of all the times of mine that time has in its grip, there is none that in one retrospect I can smile at half so much, and think of half so tenderly. End of chapter 33.
Of David Copperfield. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Tig Hines. David Copperfield by Charles Dickens. Chapter 34. My aunt astonishes me.
I wrote to Agnes as soon as Dora and I were engaged. I wrote her a long letter, in which I tried to make her comprehend how blessed I was, and what a darling Dora was. I entreated Agnes not to regard this as a thoughtless passion which could ever yield to any other, or have the least resemblance to the boyish fancies that we used to joke about. I assured her that its profundity was quite unfathomable, and expressed my belief that nothing like it had ever been known. Somehow, as I wrote to Agnes on a fine evening by my open window, and the remembrance of her clear calm eyes and gentle face came stealing over me, it shed such a peaceful influence upon the hurry and agitation in which I had been living lately, and of which my very happiness partook in some degree, that it soothed me into tears. I remember I sat resting my head upon my hand when the letter was half done, cherishing a general fancy as if Agnes were one of the elements of my natural home. As if in the retirement of the house made almost sacred to me by her presence, Dora and I must be happier than anywhere. As if in love, joy, sorrow, hope, or disappointment, in all emotions, my heart turned naturally there, and found its refuge and best friend. Of Steerforth I said nothing. I only told her there had been sad grief at Yarmouth on account of Emily's flight, and that on me it made a double wound by reason of the circumstances attending it. I knew how quick she always was to divine the truth, and that she would never be the first to breathe his name. To this letter I received an answer by return of post. As I read it I seemed to hear Agnes speaking to me. It was like her cordial voice in my ears. What can I say more? While I had been away from home lately, Traddles had called twice or thrice. Finding Peggotty within, and being informed by Peggotty, who always volunteered that information to whomsoever would receive it, that she was my old nurse, he had established a good-humoured acquaintance with her, and had stayed to have a little chat with her about me. So Peggotty said, but I am afraid the chat was all on her own side, and of immoderate length, as she was very difficult indeed to stop, God bless her, when she had me for her theme. This reminds me, not only that I expected Traddles on a certain afternoon of his own appointing, which was now come, but that Mrs. Crupp had resigned everything appertaining to her office, the salary excepted, until Peggotty should cease to present herself. Mrs. Crupp, after holding divers conversations respecting Peggotty in a very high-pitched voice on the staircase, with some invisible familiar it would appear, for corporeally speaking she was quite alone at those times, addressed a letter to me, developing her views, beginning it with that statement of universal application which fitted every occurrence of her life, namely, that she was a mother herself. She went on to inform me that she had once seen very different days, but that at all periods of her existence she had had a constitutional objection to spies, intruders, and informers. She named no names, she said. Let them the cap fitted wear it. But spies, intruders, and informers, especially in widow's weeds, this clause was underlined, she had ever accustomed herself to look down upon. If a gentleman was the victim of spies, intruders, and informers, but still naming no names, that was his own pleasure. He had a right to please himself, so let him do. All that she, Mrs. Crupp, stipulated for was, that she should not be brought in contract with such persons. Therefore she begged to be excused from any further attendance on the top set, until things were as they formerly was, and as they could be wished to be, and further mentioned that her little book would be found on the breakfast table every Saturday morning, when she requested an immediate settlement of the same, with the benevolent view of saving trouble, and an ill convenience to all parties. After this, Mrs. Crupp confined herself to making pitfalls on the stairs, principally with pitchers, and endeavouring to delude Peggotty into breaking her legs. I found it rather harassing to live in this state of siege, but was too much afraid of Mrs. Crupp to see any way out of it. 'My dear Copperfield,' cried Traddles, punctually appearing at my door, in spite of all these obstacles, 'how do you do?' 'My dear Traddles,' said I am delighted to see you at last, and very sorry not to have been home before, but I have been so much engaged.' 'Yes, I know,' said Traddles, 'of course. Yours lives in London, I think.' 'What did you say?' 'She, excuse me, Miss D, you know,' said Traddles, colouring in his great delicacy, 'lives in London, I believe.' 'Oh yes, near London.' 'Mine, perhaps you recollect,' said Traddles, with a serious look, 'lives down in Devonshire, one of 10. Consequently I am not so much engaged as you, in that sense. 'I wonder you can bear,' I returned, 'to see her so seldom.' 'Ah,' said Traddles thoughtfully, 'it does seem a wonder. I suppose it is, Copperfield, because there is no help for it.' 'I suppose so,' I replied with a smile, and not without a blush, 'and because you have so much constancy and patience, Traddles.' 'Dear me,' said Traddles, considering about it, 'do I strike you in that way, Copperfield? Really, I didn't know that I had. But she is such an extraordinarily dear girl herself, that it's possible she may have imparted something of those virtues to me. Now you mention it, Copperfield, I shouldn't wonder at all. I assure you she is always forgetting herself, and taking care of the other 9. 'Is she the eldest?' I inquired. 'Oh dear no,' said Traddles, 'the eldest is a beauty.' He saw, I suppose, that I could not help smiling at the simplicity of this reply, and added, with a smile upon his own ingenuous face, 'Not of course but that my Sophy, pretty name, Copperfield, I always think.' 'Very pretty,' said I. 'Not of course but that Sophy is beautiful too, in my eyes, and would be one of the dearest girls that ever was, in anybody's eyes, I should think. But when I say the eldest is a beauty, I mean she really is a—' He seemed to be describing clouds about himself with both hands. 'Splendid, you know,' said Traddles energetically. 'Indeed,' said I. 'Oh, I assure you,' said Traddles, 'something very uncommon indeed. Then you know, being formed for society and admiration, and not being able to enjoy much of it in consequence of their limited means, she naturally gets a little irritable and exacting sometimes. Sophy puts her in good humour.' 'Is Sophy the youngest?' I hazarded. 'Oh dear no,' said Traddles, stroking his chin, 'the 2 youngest are only 9 and 10. Sophy educates 'em.' 'The second daughter, perhaps,' I hazarded. 'No,' said Traddles, 'Sarah's the second. Sarah has something the matter with her spine, poor girl. The malady will wear out by and by, the doctors say, but in the mean time she has to lie down for a 12-month. Sophy nurses her. Sophy's the 4th. 'Is the mother living?' I inquired. 'Oh yes,' said Traddles, 'she is alive. She is a very superior woman indeed, but the damp country is not adapted to her constitution, and, in fact, she has lost the use of her limbs.' 'Dear me,' said I. 'Very sad, is it not?' returned Traddles, 'but in a merely domestic view it is not so bad as it might be, because Sophy takes her place. She is quite as much a mother to her mother as she is to the other 9. I felt the greatest admiration for the virtues of this young lady, and honestly, with the view of doing my best to prevent the good nature of Traddles from being imposed upon, to the detriment of their joint prospects in life, inquired how Mr Micawber was. 'He's quite well, Copperfield, thank you,' said Traddles. 'I'm not living with him at present.' 'No?' 'No, you see, the truth is,' said Traddles in a whisper, 'he had changed his name to Mortimer in consequence of his temporary embarrassments, and he don't come out till after dark, and then in spectacles. There was an execution put into our house for rent. Mrs Micawber was in such a dreadful state that I really couldn't resist giving my name to that second bill we spoke of here. You may imagine how delightful it was to my feelings, Copperfield, to see the matter settled with it, and Mrs Micawber recover her spirits.' 'I said. 'Not that our happiness was of long duration,' pursued Traddles, 'for unfortunately within a week another execution came. It broke up the establishment. I have been living in a furnished apartment since then, and the Mortimers have been very private indeed. I hope you won't think it selfish, Copperfield, if I mention that the broker carried off my little round table with the marble top, and Sophy's flower pot and stand.' 'What a hard thing!' I exclaimed indignantly. 'It was a pull,' said Traddles, with his usual wince at the expression. 'I don't mention it reproachfully, however, but with a motive. The fact is, Copperfield, I was unable to repurchase them at the time of their seizure. In the first place, because the broker, having an idea that I wanted them, ran the price up to an extravagant extent, and in the second place, because I hadn't any money. Now, I have kept my eye since upon the broker's shop,' said Traddles, with a great enjoyment of his mystery, which is up at the top of Tottenham Court Road, and at last, to-day, I find them put out for sale. I have only noticed them from over the way, because if the broker saw me, bless you, he'd ask any price for them. What has occurred to me, having now the money, is, that perhaps you wouldn't object to ask that good nurse of yours to come with me to the shop. I can show it her from around the corner of the next street, and make the best bargain for them, as if they were for herself, that she can.' The delight with which Traddles propounded this plan to me, and the sense he had of its uncommon artfulness, are among the freshest things in my remembrance. I told him that my old nurse would be delighted to assist him, and that we would all three take the field together, but on one condition. That condition was, that he should make a solemn resolution to grant no more loans of his name, or anything else, to Mr. Micawber. 'My dear Copperfield,' said Traddles, 'I have already done so, because I begin to feel that I have not only been inconsiderate, but that I have been positively unjust to Sophy. My word being passed to myself, there is no longer any apprehension, but I pledge it to you too, with the greatest readiness. That first unlucky obligation I have paid. I have no doubt Mr. Micawber would have paid it if he could, but he could not. One thing I ought to mention, which I like very much in Mr. Micawber, Copperfield. It refers to the second obligation, which is not yet due. He don't tell me that it is provided for, but he says it will be. Now, I think there is something very fair and honest about that.' I was unwilling to damp my good friend's confidence, and therefore assented. After a little further conversation, we went round to the chandler's shop, to enlist Peggotty, Traddles declining to pass the evening with me, both because he endured the liveliest apprehensions that his property would be bought by somebody else before he could repurchase it, and because it was the evening he always devoted to writing to the dearest girl in the world. I shall never forget him peeping round the corner of the street in Tottenham Court Road, while Peggotty was bargaining for the precious articles, or his agitation when she came slowly towards us after vainly offering a price, and was hailed by the relenting broker and went back again. The end of the negotiation was, that she bought the property on tolerably easy terms, and Traddles was transported with pleasure. 'I am very much obliged to you indeed,' said Traddles, on hearing it was to be sent to where he lived that night. 'If I might ask one other favour, I hope you would not think it absurd, Copperfield.' I said beforehand, certainly not. 'Then, if you would be good enough,' said Traddles to Peggotty, 'to get the flower pot now, I think I should like, it being Sophy's, Copperfield, to carry it home myself.' Peggotty was glad to get it for him, and he overwhelmed her with thanks, and went his way up Tottenham Court Road, carrying the flower pot affectionately in his arms, with one of the most delighted expressions of countenance I ever saw. We then turned back towards my chambers. As the shops had charms for Peggotty which I never knew them possess in the same degree for anybody else, I sauntered easily along, amused by her staring in at the windows, and waiting for her as often as she chose. We were thus a good while in getting to the Adelphi. On our way upstairs I called her attention to the sudden disappearance of Mrs. Crupp's pitfalls, and also to the prints of recent footsteps. We were both very much surprised, coming higher up, to find my outer door standing open, which I had shut, and to hear voices inside. We looked at one another without knowing what to make of this, and went into the sitting room. What was my amazement to find, of all people upon earth, my aunt there, and Mr. Dick. My aunt sitting on a quantity of luggage, with her 2 birds before her, and her cat on her knee, like a female Robinson Crusoe, drinking tea. Mr. Dick leaning thoughtfully on a great kite, such as we had often been out together to fly, with more luggage piled about him. 'My dear aunt,' cried I, 'why, what an unexpected pleasure!' We cordially embraced, and Mr. Dick and I cordially shook hands, and Mrs. Crupp, who was busy making tea, and could not be too attentive, cordially said that she knowed well as Mr. Copperfull would have his heart in his mouth when he see his dear relations. 'Hello,' said my aunt to Peggotty, who quailed before her awful presence, 'how are you?' 'You remember my aunt, Peggotty,' said I. 'For the love of goodness, child,' exclaimed my aunt, 'don't call the woman by that South Sea Island name. If she married and got rid of it, which was the best thing she could do, why don't you give her the benefit of the change? What's your name now, P?' said my aunt, as a compromise for the obnoxious appellation. 'Barkis, ma'am,' said Peggotty with a curtsey. 'Well, that's human,' said my aunt. 'It sounds less as if you wanted a missionary. How do you do, Barkis? I hope you are well.' Encouraged by these gracious words, and by my aunt's extending her hand, Barkis came forward, and took the hand, and curtsied her acknowledgments. 'We are older than we were, I see,' said my aunt. 'We have only met each other once before, you know. A nice business we made of it then. Trot, my dear, another cup.' I handed it dutifully to my aunt, who was in her usual inflexible state of figure, and ventured a remonstrance with her on the subject of her sitting on a box. 'Let me draw the sofa here, or the easy chair, aunt,' said I. 'Why should you be so uncomfortable?' 'Thank you, Trot,' replied my aunt, 'I prefer to sit upon my property.
Here my aunt looked hard at Mrs. Crupp, and observed, 'We needn't trouble you to wait, ma'am.' 'Shall I put a little more tea in the pot afore I go, ma'am?' said Mrs. Crupp. 'No, I thank you, ma'am,' replied my aunt. 'Would you let me fetch another pat of butter, ma'am?' said Mrs. Crupp, 'or would ye be persuaded to try a new laid hegg, or should I brile a rasher? Ain't there nothing I could do for your dear aunt, Mr. Copperfull?' 'Nothing, ma'am,' returned my aunt, 'I shall do very well, thank you.' Mrs. Crupp, who had been incessantly smiling to express sweet temper, and incessantly holding her head on one side to express a general feebleness of constitution, and incessantly rubbing her hands to express a desire to be of service to all deserving objects, gradually smiled herself, one-sided herself, and rubbed herself out of the room. 'Dick,' said my aunt, 'you know what I told you about time servers and wealth worshippers?' Mr. Dick, with rather a scared look, as if he had forgotten it, returned a hasty answer in the affirmative. 'Mrs. Crupp is one of them,' said my aunt. 'Barkis, I'll trouble you to look after the tea, and let me have another cup, for I don't fancy that woman's pouring out.' I knew my aunt sufficiently well to know that she had something of importance on her mind, and that there was far more matter in this arrival than a stranger might have supposed. I noticed how her eye lighted on me when she thought my attention otherwise occupied, and what a curious process of hesitation appeared to be going on within her while she preserved her outward stiffness and composure. I began to reflect whether I had done anything to offend her, and my conscience whispered to me that I had not yet told her about Dora. Could it by any means be that, I wondered? As I knew she would only speak in her own good time, I sat down near her, and spoke to the birds, and played with the cat, and was as easy as I could be. But I was far from being really easy, and I should still have been so, even if Mr. Dick, leaning over the great kite behind my aunt, had not taken every secret opportunity of shaking his head darkly at me, and pointing at her. 'Trot,' said my aunt at last, when she had finished her tea, and carefully smoothed down her dress, and wiped her lips, 'you needn't go, Barkis. Trot, have you got to be firm and self-reliant?' 'I hope so, aunt.' 'What do you think?' inquired Miss Betsy. 'I think so, aunt.' 'Then why, my love,' said my aunt, looking earnestly at me, 'why do you think I prefer to sit upon this property of mine to-night?' I shook my head, unable to guess. 'Because,' said my aunt, 'it's all I have. Because I'm ruined, my dear. If the house and every one of us had tumbled out into the river together, I could hardly have received a greater shock. Dick knows it,' said my aunt, laying her hand calmly on my shoulder. 'I am ruined, my dear Trot. All I have in the world is in this room, except the cottage, and that I have left Janet to let. Barkis, I want to get a bed for this gentleman to-night. To save expense, perhaps you can make up something here for myself. Anything will do, it's only for to-night. We'll talk about this more to-morrow.' I was roused from my amazement and concern for her, I am sure for her, by her falling on my neck for a moment, and crying that she only grieved for me. In another moment she suppressed this emotion, and said with an aspect more triumphant than dejected, 'We must meet reverses boldly, and not suffer them to frighten us, my dear. We must learn to act the play out. We must live misfortune down, Trot.' Chapter 34